Welcome, everyone. We will get started in 1 minute. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started with the first session of the Identifying and Dismantling White Supremacy webinar series that is sponsored by the Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network. The Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network is a network of individuals and organizations, agencies, policymakers who care about ending hunger. And we recognize that to achieve this goal, we must discuss race and apply a racial equity lens to everything we do in our work. We're a group of individuals across the country, local, state, regional, even national groups that are committed to sharing best practices and engaging in internal and external changes to end hunger. We focus on 3 particular areas, and one is learning. That means to learn more deeply about what racial equity is and from one another. 2 is empowering ourselves, our network, and our partners with the tools and resources to understand how to apply racial equity into our practices, our policies, and all our programs. And then identify. We want to identify ways that we can work together as a network to strengthen our individual organizations, but also strengthen the work that we do in our respective communities. Please visit racialequityhunger.org for more information about the Learning Network, including listening to our recent podcast series that we put out about racial equity, hunger, and COVID-19.
My name is Amber Booth McCoy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the CEO of the Diversity Booth. As of February this year, also a TEDx speaker, and also I am a member of the Black diaspora. This is the way I identify as Black, not African American, because I ascribe that to my friends that maybe are Ghanaian or Nigerian, whereas when I say Black, I mean that I am a member of the diaspora. However, even before we begin to have a discussion on white supremacy, Donald and I want to make sure that we acknowledge the land on which we are presenting. In Arkansas, this is the land of the Osage and the Quapaw. It would be unjust of us in this communication and in this webinar to talk about white supremacy without acknowledging the voices that we're unable to hear at this time, which would be the people or indigenous people of this land.
Thank you, Amber. And my name is Donald Wood, and I'm the Executive Director of Just Communities of Arkansas and a partner with Amber and her organization. I'm also one of 4 co-chairs of the Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network, along with Marlisa Gamblin, Marianne Buggs, and Monica Gonzalez. I have of Northwestern European descent and identify as white, and my pronouns are he, him, his. this topic that we're going to be discussing and presenting on, and towards the end, hopefully having a bit of discussion on, is one that's probably not common to us in our regular daily conversations. And although it's something that is pervasive and affects all of us in this entire country, and in the work that we do, the work that Amber and I do, we think it's critically important that in order for us to co-create an effective solution to a problem or to an issue, especially one as complex and as messy as racism and white supremacy, that we must first have an appropriate diagnosis. We must first understand the issue, and that means getting at the truth. And so in the work that we do, what we try to do is create an environment or a space where folks are tripping over the truth, as we like to say. Sometimes that this needs to be intentional, and so that's why we participate in programming like this. Sometimes it happens in our everyday life, and depending on our level of being woke to racial equity and the system of racism, those type of tripping over the truth moments happen. So I wanted to talk a little bit about one of my tripping over the truth moments that occurred when I was running an end-of-life care foundation several years ago. I was in a workshop and learning about how to kind of be on the cutting edge of work being done in hospice and palliative care. And a presenter from Duke, as part of a partnership between the Duke Divinity School and the Duke Medical School, shared this comment. And the comment, and then what followed that comment, talking about the fact that African Americans especially, but other marginalized communities, are at risk of not dying well. And if you've had an end-of-life experience with a loved one and had a good experience, how amazing and how much of a human right it is to have a good death. And if you've been with a loved one and had the experience of not having a good death, someone dying a bad death, how horrendously traumatic and horrible it is, not just for the person that is dying and has passed away, but also for the family and the loved ones of that person. And to learn that simply based on the color of someone's skin, that they were at risk of not dying well. And the fact that there is all kinds of different mechanisms in place that cause that, talking about economical factors, education factors, definitely public health factors that lead to that surround people of color and cause them literally to be weathered because of the color of their skin, was one of my main tripping over the truth moments. And I share that because, again, it's important for you to know that as we go through the remaining hour and 20, 25 minutes of this, and throughout the rest of the webinar series, we are going to do our best to create a space where we are helping folks trip over those truths and really lean into what's learned from those truths. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into the complete history of racism and white supremacy, but we will do our best to create the capacity for you as an individual to pursue that truth in order to be prepared to dismantle it and rebuild something that is racially equitable. So how we do that with JCA and the diversity booth is we focus on what we call or is what's known as the cycle of liberation. Liberation strictly means that freeing people from oppression, freeing people from any form of slavery is what we mean by liberation. And so we use the cycle of liberation as a way to contextualize the process of moving from the intrapersonal and the individual work that needs to be done to the interpersonal work that needs to be done to the institutional work that needs to be done, that then leads to the systemic or the cultural, in the context of a community, work that needs to be done. And this is a cycle. And we feel it's important to really put an emphasis on the intrapersonal piece and the interpersonal piece, because sometimes we tend to skip over and move straight to the institutional work, which is critically important. But if we're not doing that intrapersonal work and the interpersonal work, sometimes that institutional change just metastasizes and transforms into another horrible form of cancer. You've got the institution of slavery, that led to convict leasing, that led to Jim Crow, that led to mass incarceration, war on drugs. And what we see is a growing racial inequity in our country. And we feel at JCA and the diversity booth that a large part of that is because we haven't focused enough on this cycle of liberation, on the interpersonal aspect. So that's kind of where we're going to focus throughout today. Why we do that is we focus on the 6 R's of the interpersonal and interpersonal change. Today, we're going to focus a lot on receiving and reflecting, realizing and reckoning with, and then spend a little bit time at the end about what it means to reach out and raise elephants. But that's really what we're going to be focusing on in our next webinar in a couple of weeks on September 1st, is that reaching out and raising elephants in our organizations in order to dismantle racism. So this is what today is going to look like. And I'm going to turn it over to Amber. But before, I want to start with our first poll question. We're going to have 3 poll questions today to kind of get a sense of where this group is at, where this community in the network is at. And this will kind of help provide also some context to the work that Amber and I are going to be sharing with you today. So you should have now on your screen the poll. You will take 15, 20 seconds to complete the poll, please. Take a couple more seconds and then I'll close the poll. We've got about 80% of the folks have voted.
Okay. 81% strongly agree. They understand the full history, truth, and consequences of racism. Okay. Well, this is the last one we have to have. This is great, Don. For the context of this conversation, we want to make sure that we share what we mean when we use certain terms and in this space. As we just saw, 81% and even strongly agree, or even 19 agree that they understand racism and the history of. And so we want to make sure that because we have such a wide, varied, and a myriad of knowledge on this call, that we explain what we mean when we use certain terms. All right. So when we discuss race and systemic racism, when we are talking about race, we are talking about a social construct designed by white people in order to classify people by their physical identities, and in order to do so, reinforcing white supremacy and or making the white race the dominant or supreme race, and being able to classify all others by this system, if you will, which has changed drastically over time, and even who could be considered white has changed over time. And as far as systemic racism, this is going to be the institutional policies, or even in society, when it comes to policies and practices that reinforce the oppression of marginalized groups, and or when it comes to race, the barriers that are put in place, whether through government policies, excuse me, or practices, or even in our businesses and organizations.
Now, another common word that obviously you hear, and it's in the title of the programming, is the term white supremacy. And, you know, we emphasize, or Amber emphasized, excuse me, about what do we mean by these terms. And, you know, it's important to understand that there is some maybe difference of opinion about some of these concepts. And in this one in particular, you'll see in a lot of definitions, whether it's, I think, in Wikipedia or even some academic fields, the idea that white supremacy is a ideology or a belief. And it's our stance that white supremacy is much more than that now, that it is no longer just an ideology or a belief, but it is actually, a reality. And it is the result of the structural racism, the systemic racism that Amber talked about. And it refers to the dominant, usually unquestioned standards of behaviors and ways of functioning in our culture, particularly in America. And it has normalized whiteness, making that the dominant culture. And it's something we have to realize, that white supremacy is something that we all inherited. None of us were alive when, race was created that led to structural racism. But even as the costs of white supremacy are exponentially more painful and destructive to people of color, it's still something that negatively affects all of us. And we were given this system. A lot of us benefit from this system, and it's incredibly important for us to realize that with white supremacy, it's essentially been kind of codified through subsystems like slavery, housing, like education, into where it's almost unnoticed. But again, it has created what is now known as our normal in the United States.
And in order to assist with terms that you may not be as familiar, but that you definitely need to know, we're talking about internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is when Black, Indigenous, and people of color have internalized what those norms are and begin to, if you will, have habits, behaviors, or ideas, or even it's often unconscious or unbeknownst to them in their behavior. And this is going to be things such as maybe how they wear their hair or their speak, or even when we're talking about, normalizing the idea or internalizing, if you pull your pants up and you dress nice, you won't die or the police won't bother you. That's internalized oppression, or an example of how that works. And it can lead to guilt, shame, stereotyping even those who look like us. And it definitely is something that, in order to have racial healing, people of color have to work at actively. I still work at this daily, making sure that I am unlearning all of the internalized oppression and racism that I have learned over the years.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, we have internalized dominance. And when we talk about internalized dominance, we're talking about the impact that white people like me feel from that white supremacy system or that white supremacy culture. It's just like with internalized oppression, it's often unbeknownst to us, it's unconscious to us, but results from that are feelings sometimes of entitlement. It's, refers to kind of this sense of the norm being, that's just how it always was, and so that therefore is how it should be. And again, in terms of whiteness being the norm, and something that comes from or sometimes is talked about in our society that's much more common, and Amber and I sort of joke about it, but it's serious, is the P word, which is privilege. And you hear that a lot associated with white privilege. And so white privilege is kind of an example of that internalized dominance. It's that benefit, oftentimes, like I said, unconscious or unbeknownst to us, but that benefit that we receive simply based on the color of our skin. White privilege does not mean that you as a white person have not experienced discrimination, or you've not experienced even systemic oppression in other forms, such as your sexual orientation or gender. But what it means is that you don't experience that system based on the color of your skin, and that you do have a different or beneficial experience than someone that identifies as a person of color. So that's what we mean by internalized dominance.
Anti-Blackness. First, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that all discrimination and all forms of prejudice and hate are wrong. It is also true when we say anti-Blackness that all discrimination and hate is not experienced equally, and that the experience of Black people, and when we say Black people, again, we are talking about the diaspora as across the globe, experience anti-Blackness or racism as a form everywhere. For instance, in between 2017 and 2018, Black people in Britain were around 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police than white people, but 3 times more likely than Asian people. So it is acknowledging that while, again, all discrimination and all people of color will experience forms of oppression and prejudice in a system that is built on white supremacy, that the experience of those who identify as Black is different. It dehumanizes the Black experience, the Black life, and devalues the Black bodies as well.
And again, on the flip side, anti-racism is something that, again, is maybe a little bit more pervasive in our vernacular these days because of the popularity of the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is important to understand as anti-racism being the opposite of anti-Blackness is a really powerful collection of anti-racist policies, procedures, programs that are intentionally designed and intentionally carried out by people that are anti-racist in order to achieve racial equity. And really what we're talking about with racial equity is, the idea that no one faces any form of oppression based on the color of their skin, and it's as simple as that. So it's not enough to just say that I'm against racism. Anti-racism really underscores the kind of active aspect of it, and also the structural attention or the systemic attention to dismantling racism. So that's what we mean by anti-racism.
Yes.
As we go through today too, we want to make sure that we model this work and what it means to be, anti-racist, but also at the same time giving you kind of a look into some of the things that you can do that we're going to talk about in more detail in the September 1st program. But part of that is the idea that intent does not equal impact, and it's critically important to not only understand the truth of racism in our country, but to do that on your own and to do that collectively, because we all know that words matter. And I think all of us know, especially people that experience racism, knows that impact matters more. So no matter how well intended we are, that the impact is what really matters. But really what should matter the most in being anti-racist is the idea of coming to a mutual understanding. So that takes work and that takes conversation, but that also takes other things such as resiliency, vulnerability, humility, all related to the idea of cultural responsiveness. So it's important that you understand that we go through this exercise or this piece of getting on the same page to some extent with these words because they matter, but it also matters that we invite everyone into where we are, and to demonstrate and model when you're having these conversations with your colleagues, especially white colleagues, that you start from a place of mutual understanding before you move forward in dismantling racist structures or racist cultures.
Weathering racial storms. When we talk about weathering racial storms, it's the acknowledgement that while we are, even now, all fighting a global pandemic and fighting that storm, we are not all doing so in the same boat. When we think about race in the terms of education or equity, what we do know is that children that grow up in poverty have less access, if you will, to more affluent school programs and even curriculums. However, these children are disproportionately affected when we're looking at African American, Latino, and other English language learners. If we're talking about maternal death rates, if we look at it by race, as a Black woman, I am 4 times more likely in Arkansas to die from maternal-related complications than from my white friends. When we are talking about the criminal justice system, and we're talking about the fact that Black and brown people make up approximately 65% of the system, but make up much less than that when we're talking about the population as a whole, We are weathering racial storms, but we are not all doing so in the same boat. Homelessness looks different by race. Families, or excuse me, Native Americans living in unsheltered homelessness is elevated, and 56% are sleeping in locations not meant for human habitation. Black families have a larger percentage of families that are homeless, as far as the representation of families and not just individuals that are homeless. Latinx populations overall have lower rates of homelessness than maybe other minority groups. But again, when we are talking about racial storms, we are all fighting multiple battles, but we are not doing so in the same boat.
So in the second part of today, we're going to get into the realizing and reckoning part, which is where we talk about understanding your relationship to and your role in white supremacy. There's the idea that there's the benefit of dominance and then the internalization of oppression, as we talked about earlier. And it's especially for white people, it's coming to that understanding and realizing that we have to build our inclusive or equitable stamina or inclusive or equitable muscle in order to really reckon with that that relationship and the role that we play in and how critically important that is. We want to do what we can to make this personal, and to not just focus on the head as we did a little bit earlier, but also focus on the heart aspect of being anti-racist. So we're going to go to the next poll question before we move on to that section. Takes about 20 seconds. About 5 more seconds.
Almost always comfortable discussing, it's 48%, always 19%, sometimes discussing 33%, and 5% say rarely comfortable discussing issues of race or how they affect communities of color. Windows and mirrors is a idea or theory that was began in the National SEED project, which is a program that stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. Windows and Mirrors focuses on the power of emotional learning through storytelling. It allows us to see, if you will, either reflections of ourselves in someone else's story, which is it's going to be mirrors. I'm able to see or identify with parts of someone's story. And if I'm unable to identify with parts of that story, it allows me windows into someone else's life. It allows me to still see, even though I'm unable to identify, hopefully, or the goal is to be able to provoke empathy, being able to, understand that that is not your relationship. When were you first aware of yourself as a member of a particular racial group?
So for me, Amber, and I appreciate you doing this, because I love that we're doing this kind of fishbowl here to kind of model for folks what it feels like, what it looks like to have these kind of conversations, but also I'm hoping that everyone kind of considers these questions internally and how they would respond to these questions. But for me, when I was first aware of myself as a particular racial group, it really came in high school. And although that I was keenly aware that people were from different races, I didn't really think about it until dating a Black girl and experiencing at least firsthand, as far as observing firsthand, how I saw that she was being treated differently, and then how we started to be treated, differently as a couple. And so it really wasn't until I was 16 or 17 that I really kind of became really aware of myself as a particular racial group, and started to understand, although I didn't have that vocabulary at the time, but understood that there was kind of a such thing as whiteness, and it was different than the black experience. So for you, oh, go ahead, sorry.
When was I first aware that I was a member of a particular racial group? I knew upon being born that I was Black. I have known my whole life upon birth, when I smelled like cocoa butter and my heart beat with Zulu drums and I could feel the ancestors flowing through my veins. I have known my whole life that I am Black.
What about though, Amber, one of the first times you experienced being treated differently because of being Black?
It was elementary, probably 4th grade. We had a substitute that day, and that she was calling roll, and I may have been talking because I do that often, and I didn't hear her call my name. And I, it's like I didn't hear her, and I was telling her that I'm here, and she told me my name wasn't Amber. There was another student that was out that day, and I don't remember her name, but I do remember it ended in an Isha and had many more syllables, if you will, than my name. And she informed me that it wasn't my name. She thought I was joking, and she threatened to send me to the principal's office, which, side note, was my father. But I think that was the first time I realized that I was being othered, if you will, and that she somehow found my name incongruent with the way I presented.
Thank you.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to, to my first answer, and I think that's kind of maybe a poignant lesson here, in that, it was so much later in life for me, and it wasn't until I was in close relationship or association with a person of color that I kind of experienced being treated differently because of my racial group. I grew up playing sports in what's called the boys club system in my hometown, and I went to a predominantly Black boys club, and a lot of my close friends were really upset the fact that I was dating a Black girl. And I remember vividly one of the guys that I played AAU basketball with, saying, why do you need to date one of ours when you can date white girls? I just remember that. I mean, I remember where we were when he said that, and I was just struck me, because we'd never, to be honest with you, we'd never had a deep or really kind of serious conversation at that point. Being 15, 16-year-old kids and just talking about sports and whatever is happening in pop culture was the extent of our seriousness. And so I remember just being kind of rattled by that, and then also the influx of comments from my white friends, ranging from couldn't believe that I'd touched a Black girl, and so they didn't want anything to do with me, to, I can't believe you're doing that. I can't believe you're dating a Black girl. But, what's it like? I mean, almost like it was this exotic thing that that was not akin to a normal dating relationship, but more of, having a student from abroad, staying at my house, was kind of the feeling that I got from some. So that was really, again, that experience, the first experience that I had, was being treated differently.
What about your racial identity are you most proud? Let's see. Oh my goodness. So a time when I was most proud. I feel like there have been so many times that I've been proud. I went to Daisy Bates Elementary, and you are from Arkansas, so you should know that, of course, Daisy Bates is a civil rights leader, and she very much assisted with the Little Rock Nine. And so I got to meet her, and I remember thinking, even at that time in elementary, like, I got to take a picture with her, because again, my dad was the principal, like, that I know her story, like, and she's in books. And then later on, of course, there were many different things, like even Michael Jackson, getting to see him and knowing who he was, or especially when Barack Obama was elected, The election of Barack Obama, I remember, and just his entire, I feel like it wasn't even him, it was his entire family. Watching his family be elected and feeling this excitement but extreme fear at the same time, for his safety and his family's safety, but the pride that I felt of seeing like myself represented. And even recently, like Gabby Douglas, like when she was, yes, and the fact that those edges were not done and she still like did all that. I was like, yes, Gabby, come through. So, what about you? What about time when you were most proud?
Yeah, I haven't thought about this lately, but this question, always troubles me and creates that discomfort, that tension, that dissonance in that I I don't think I've ever felt proud of my racial identity. And I think that goes, and the more I think about it after what we talked about earlier, is absolutely a result of the normalization of whiteness. And that's an example of, white supremacy in that I was so used to seeing and looking in mirrors that where you talk about seeing the Obama family or seeing Gabby Douglas or seeing other, people of color do, amazing things because of inequity, because of structural racism. Those opportunities have been few and far between. But for people like me that look like me, it's the norm. It's common. So everywhere I looked, I saw white, especially cisgender men, but I saw white people everywhere. And so I never ever thought until I started doing this work about whiteness as a race or as a social construct. I never even knew what Caucasian meant. So I just checked it if it was the only option. That's what I was told by people when I was young, that I was Caucasian. But really thinking about whiteness, I've never felt pride.
And you don't, and I guess for me, I am always lumped with the whole, right? So like you get to be an individual white person, whereas I am, if somebody does something good, it's on me. And if somebody does something bad, it's on me. So that pride is because if they get it, I get it. Like it's I get to ascribe, to that success because of the things that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and it's baked into our conscious. I mean, I think you've mentioned before that people talk about Barack Obama as the first black president. We don't call Donald Trump the 44th white president. That's not
Never
the
said it. Never
yeah
had to ever.
again, because that's the norm, and it's just so common we don't even think about it. But anyway, so what about this final kind of question? And I just want you to answer this, if you don't mind. Is what is one of the most challenging things about being black and being especially being black and American? How do you face it?
I think the most challenging part is the intersectionality for me. I am Black and I am lumped with Black people, but often as a female, I'm supposed to identify with, the burning bras and the, movements that are feminine. But when I think about it, in 1920, I am in a historically Black sorority. So I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. And we and other members, such as the members of Delta Sigma Theta, fought for the right to vote. We stood alongside white women and we said, we want to vote, and you doggone right, women should have the right to vote, and we want our voice to be heard. And then in 1965, because while I am a woman, I am Black. In 1965 is when I actually achieved that right. But I had fought for it, or my people had fought for it years and years before that. So I think that that's the challenging part, being in these two groups that are never separate for me. I am Black, but I am always a Black woman, and the two are never separate for me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I look forward to maybe kind of delving in a little deeper about intersectionality in our next webinar, and how important that lens is in order to be effective at fighting racism. And driving in today, I heard radio talking about the anniversary of the women's right to vote and the suffrage movement, and there was no mention of the fact that no, Black women couldn't vote.
No,
and
no.
and it's just so common. And I see the most well-intentioned white women who are very involved in my organization in this community, but also involved in the festivities that are going on as far as honoring. And I don't hear a word about this fact of because there's no intersectional lens to it. It's
Right.
we say women, but no,
It wasn't women. It was white women.
It wasn't. And again, that's just kind of an example of our white supremacy culture, and that it is so normalized and it's something that we're not taught, or we don't take the time to truly understand, or sometimes don't even believe that that's even possible, because we've progressed so much in our community. But the question is, have we? So now, everyone, for this kind of the third and final section of today, we're going to get into the kind of transition into the interpersonal part of dismantling racism and what we call reaching out and raising elephants. This is going to be also, though, kind of a platform into our next program, where we're going to really focus on the how to as individuals and how to as organizations do we behave in anti-racist ways, and in order to do that, I want to kind of take a step back and share with you our theory of change at JCA, and how we try to help folks and facilitate folks going from that understanding to acting. We've sort of been doing that today, because this is how we design all our programs, but this is going to be kind of core of what we do next week. We do our best to co-create a courageous space, because I've mentioned earlier how critically important that is for folks to feel psychologically safe enough in order to have these difficult conversations. And we've provided new information, and that entails the explanation aspect of and coming to that mutual understanding, making it personal, and leveraging creative tension. I'll talk about in just a second. And then what we do, and what we'll really focus on again on September 1st, is amplifying people's ability to act, because our feeling is that everyone has that ability themselves. It's just a matter of how do we figure out ways to amplify people's ability to act. So before we do that, though, we will have our last poll question of today. Please take about 20 seconds to respond. Take about 5 more seconds, please. All right, so I guess good news, and not too terribly surprising, considering the group that we assume was on this call, that self-selected to be here, that a good portion of you feel that this is something that is core to who you are as an organization, and that's communicated explicitly. A little over 1 out of 10 of you said that no, and then a little over half of you say they're moving in that direction. So that is obviously very good to hear, and something that probably doesn't reflect the overall community, but one that kind of helps set the context for what we'll be talking about here at the end. And when we talk about understanding what an anti-racist culture is, it's an important part of systems change theory and collective action theory, in that if we are going to change something that is as complex and messy as systemic racism, that we've got to create that tension between where we are, what is our reality, which is just what we talked about earlier, especially when Amber was hitting home the statistics about where we are as a country in terms of racism. So understanding that current reality, reflecting on it, like I said, and reckoning with our relationship to that, but then also establishing that vision and where we want to be. What is our aspiration? And when you have that tension, then we feel that's where you kind of then develop that energy to make those changes. And it's about managing that. It's about leveraging that tension, because you can't go too hard, too much, and not bring other folks along, because when the rubber band is too tight, an example of tension, it breaks. But you also can't be too slow. You can't drag your feet on it. And so you've got a rubber band, that tension is not strong enough, then it's an ineffective, tool. And so we think it's extremely important to help you all paint the picture and understand what an anti-racist culture looks like. So we're going to kind of end today with that before we get into the question and answer part at the beginning. So I'm going to give you from my perspective of what does anti-racism look like. And I kind of label this under the 3 Ds. For me, alliteration is really helpful in remembering things, and so I do my best to do that. This one didn't work out so perfectly, but what I mean by diversity as the first D, but the idea really of not checkbox diversity. So the idea of checkbox diversity, and I think a lot of you all may not have heard this term before, but as soon as I explain it, you'll really understand that a lot of organizations pursue diversity and equity and inclusion, but really stop at the diversity part. They stop at just trying to get some level of diverse representation, which really sometimes even ends in tokenism and is not really representative of the community that's being served. But the idea of not checkbox diversity is really an idea of leadership, and it's the buy-in from leadership about what equity and inclusion means to the organization. So when I talk about not checkbox diversity, what I'm talking about is that an anti-racist culture, the leadership is modeling the way. The leadership has the skills and the confidence to have discussions about race and racism within the context of the organization. The leadership is engaging the entire community of the organization, including those that they serve, in the process of creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion culture. And it's just like with any organization, has finance, operations, programming. DEI has got to be a critical part of all of those. And so you have to have an intentional DEI plan or strategy in order to not be just a typical checkbox diversity organization. So that's the first one. The second one is data. What an anti-racism culture looks like is one that really focuses on using data to understand its current culture. Amber and I have been talking in the broader context of what anti-racism is, what anti-blackness is, white supremacy is in particular. But within an organization, you have got to be one that focuses on gathering the data, not just gathering the data in a moment of time, but having a system and a culture continuously gathering data, being transparent about that data, disaggregating that data, and looking at how people of color are being impacted, both from a standpoint of quantitative aspects as far as diversity in leadership, promotion, those type of things, recruitment, retention, but also in subjective sentiment. So how are people feeling? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel that they belong? Do they feel that their voice is given equal opportunity at the proverbial table? So data is a key part of what an anti-racist culture looks like. And the final one that I'll mention is just design. An anti-racist culture is intentional about how the organizational space, not just physically, but also culturally, is designed. And that means, for example, that affinity groups, or some people refer to them as maybe ERGs, employee resource groups, or ARGs, associate resource groups, are a critical part of your organization, especially if you already have a diverse representative group, because people of color need these spaces as part of an integral piece of the healing process. And a part of equity is providing spaces for people that have been marginalized, that have not been part of the dominant culture, in order for them to feel valued, to feel respected. And so it's very important that that is something that is part of the ethos or the design of an organization in order for it to be an anti-racist culture. In addition to the physical aspect of it, making sure that employees see other people of color looking in the mirror that are in positions of authority or power, or in management and leadership positions. But even to the marketing and communications of your organization, you look at how you're communicating to the world about who you are and who you serve, and does that reflect the community that you are trying to serve? So there's also the physical aspect of design.
What anti-racism looks like to me. First, it's the acknowledgement that matter is the minimum. And what I mean by that is, even if we just look at current climate and culture, right now there is a 3-word sentence that is causing unrest across the globe. It is making some uncomfortable, but for many it is affirming and warm, and that is Black Lives Matter. The frustrating part for me is, one, that there are people saying Black Lives Matter and it is being met with opposition. But first, Merriam-Webster defines the word matter as a subject under consideration. So a population of people are asking for your consideration, and it's being met with opposition. Matter is the minimum is when the culture is reflective of everyone. When we say, if people are going to say all lives matter, then it actually means that all lives matter. When we say minimum is the matter, it means that Rihanna is not touted and held up for having the most complex line of foundation, because that's the norm. It means when matter is the minimum, that I can go in any Walgreens and find shampoo for my hair. I don't have to go in the specific Walgreens on this side of town to find hair products. When matter is the minimum, equity is something that happens when we're talking about education, regardless of what the students look like. When we're updating and building new schools, then we're doing it in every neighborhood. We're not just closing schools in Black and brown neighborhoods or not giving them access to the same programs. When matter is the minimum, then everybody is included, valued, and heard. Anti-racism for me also looks like when fear is not the norm. I got married in 2018, and we have 2 boys. They are 14 and 17. Oh my gosh. When my husband says, let's have a baby, me just thinking that he's a fool because the boys are 14 and 17 is as simple as just that, not the fact that it terrifies me because I'm 3 to 4 times more likely to die than my white friends. When fear isn't the norm, I don't worry when my sons ask me to walk to the store, because they may make it home. They're going to make it home in an anti-racist society, not that they could be followed, killed by a neighbor like Trayvon Martin. In an anti-racist society, I know that everybody is going to be heard regardless of their skin tone. In an anti-racist society, fear is not when I am driving home and hoping and I get stopped. And my biggest fear is that I get a ticket, not that my life is going to end like Sandra Bland. So anti-racist society for me is when fear is not the norm. And then lastly, an anti-racist society for me is when assimilation is not the expectation. This is when my Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean friends don't have to pick American names because people don't want to say their name. Assimilation is not the expectation. For me, is when there isn't legislation. Right now, many states are passing what's called the Crown Act. This is legislation so that I can wear my hair the way it naturally grows out of my head. So an anti-racist society for me looks like days when there's no law needed for me to have legislation passed, or no need for me to have legislation passed for me to wear my hair the way it grows out of my scalp. My hair doesn't fall like this when it grows out. It grows up towards God. It's what I tell my son. It kisses the sun. Assimilation isn't the norm.
But we ask, what does anti-racism feel like?
So when we were coming up with what anti-racism feels like, I tried to come up with all of these ideas because what I know is what affirmation feels like. I know that Don, as a white man, is my friend, and that I feel affirmed when we talk. He understands, how to center voices that don't often get centered. I have friends that don't look like me, my non-Black and my white friends, where I feel heard or affirmed. There are organizations where other Black people or people of color or Indigenous people feel as though their opinion matters. But I have absolutely no context for what it feels like in society, because that's one space. This space where I feel affirmed with Don, that's one space. When I leave that space, I go into a society where Black people and brown people are making up the prison system, or there is inequitable resources when we're talking about education. I'm trying to figure out why the COVID stats look like they do, because Black and brown people are dying at higher rates, even though they don't make up more of the population. I don't have any context whatsoever for what a non racist or an anti-racist society feels like. I have what spaces feel like. I have what my friend groups feel like, or maybe what equitable organizations who are being intentional about inclusivity feel like. But at large, I've never experienced such. I have absolutely no idea, and I didn't know how much it hurt thinking about it until Don asked this question yesterday.
Thank you, Amber, for sharing that. And to everyone now, as we wrap up the presentation part, and right before we move to the Q&A, I just again just want to emphasize how much I appreciate Amber sharing that, because this was a difficult conversation that we had yesterday. It's so important that we really lean into how we're feeling, not only right now, but how we feel when we consider having a conversation around white supremacy or racism. That tension, that discomfort. And as white people, it's not hyperbole to say that this is a life or death matter, that our white silence, our white complicity in not actively dismantling racism is just perpetuating not only oppression, but perpetuating the death of Black and brown bodies. And that's a feeling we have to own and consume and process almost continuously. And it's difficult. Trust me, it is difficult. And we'll talk more on September 1st about self-care and how important that is to being anti-racist. But before we move to the Q&A, we want to ask you all a question, and we hope that this is a moment too where you can take a deep breath. But we want to hear how you all are feeling right now, in particular to your relationship to white supremacy. So we're going to pop up this information here. It's going to give you the opportunity whether to text it or go to the website. And I want you to take the next minute in 3 words or less to describe how you're feeling right now about your relationship to white supremacy. Tell us how you're feeling, please, if you're comfortable.
Anxious for action. The same. Time to act. Alone. Frustration, exhaustion, upset, complicit and ashamed, frustrated, alone, frustrated, sad, aware, appalled, ashamed, struck, confused,
Overwhelmed,
worried,
hopeful,
deeply ingrained in the same, trapped and ashamed. Wow. Overwhelmed, embarrassed, not doing enough. Let's destroy it. Afraid for my children. Don't get me started. Don knows I'm not even able to talk about my boys. Anxiety, hopeful, fatigued. So we have we do what's called healing spaces often, and we ask during, or one of the prompts is to give a word about kind of the feeling that you have about everything going on. And frustrated and exhausted is always my word. I try to search for other words, but frustrated and exhausted is where I go most often. I absolutely love what Don and I get to do. I love being able to have platforms to say these type of things, and it doesn't change the fact that once I get off a webinar, I'm still a Black woman. So the fight is still the same. Nothing has changed because I picked up an hour to talk about what it is. So I'm often exhausted, still lacking awareness, helpless, fired up, unnatural, appalled.
Okay, we'll give it just a few more seconds. We want to make sure everyone has a chance.
Impatient. I saw when all the protests started, there was an 80-year-old woman on the steps of the Capitol in Arkansas. And we know she was 80 because she was an 80-year-old white woman. She had a sign up and said, "I'm 80 years old and I can't believe I'm still having to protest this explicit word here." And I thought to myself, if she is tired at 80 and I'm tired at 35, we in trouble. Like she's still protesting at 80, the same things that she was protesting at my age. I'm too exhausted. I'm exhausted. Embarrassed, confused, determined and overwhelmed.
So as we look at these words, oh, excuse me, Amber.
No, go ahead.
As we look at these words, I want to communicate to white people, especially the white people that listed a lot of these words that would fall under that category of discomfort, to really sit with that and own those feelings and ask yourself, where you want to be as a person, as an anti-racist, as an ally, and where you are. And if having these feelings and these feelings being the barriers to you doing what you need to do to fight white supremacy, ask yourself, are you okay with that? And if you are, I don't know how to describe
If
how
you
I
are, you are,
yeah,
just know you're contributing to those people not dying well.
right, absolutely. And so, but I hope that, again, you embrace and own these feelings and sit with them, because we're in the business, Amber and I, of helping people get comfortable being uncomfortable. Trust me, it does get easier, but it's never truly easy. But nothing really worth fighting for, I think, is easy. So and to people of color, that shared these things, thank you. One of the reasons we do this white supremacy program is also to hopefully validate your lived experience in a setting like this, in front of with other colleagues, and hopefully give you some sort of insight into what white people are experiencing, although know that this job of dismantling racism is mostly the job for white people. That's one of the aspects of whiteness and white supremacy, is that we hold a significant amount of the power. And so to me, it is our ultimate responsibility to step up, never step over, but to step up or even step aside in order for racial equity to happen.
I think
So
the other part of that, I would say the other part of that is that the responsibility, while it sounds unfair, the emotional labor and even the responsibility to dismantle a system that people of color didn't create, it would be akin to me, coming to your house or inviting you to my house and making you clean up my house. People of color didn't create systemic racism. People of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color did not create white supremacy. So dismantling such and is, tantamount to that being racism in itself. So yes, being a co-conspirator or an ally and breaking that down, the majority of the responsibility would fall on those who benefit from the system that is causing the oppression.
absolutely. So in the last 15 to 20 or so minutes, we want to open it up for any questions for me and or Amber, or the comments you want to share with the group. Now, we recognize that there are hundreds of people on this call. So what we ask you to do is, in the question section, not the chat section, but in the question section, if you'd like to submit questions or comments for us to respond to or to read, please do. But before we do that, it's important for us to establish as best we can, or help co-create with you all, this being a courageous space. We realize that even with the anonymity of the virtual world, that it's still difficult to put yourselves out there in a space like this. So if you think about the beginning of a sentence like, I feel respected when, or in order to feel safe enough to have a real conversation, I need, kind of think about what you need, and think of that. Likely that's what other people too will need, not always, but likely other people will need too. And that could be things as open-mindedness, respect. But a couple things we want to make sure that you understand is that these are kind of agreements that we use a lot at the work that we do. But what's said in here, if we ask that you don't call out any names of anybody in particular that may be from your organization or your community, that but what's said in here stays here, but what you learn here leaves, and that's the Vegas twist. I already talked about intent does not equal impact. So realize if something is shared that lands on somebody wrong, and they respond to that in a way, to see that as a gift and an opportunity for you to strengthen your relationship with them, and seek forgiveness and understand how you can do better next time. That's what we mean by intent does not equal impact. And be sure to use I statements. We don't expect you to recognize or represent your entire community or the cultures that you identify with. And we also don't expect you to bring in other people's shared experience that you heard about into this, but this is about you bringing yourself to this space and just using I statements. So with that said, I want to turn it over to you all. And again, in the question section, If you'd like to submit any questions for Amber or I to respond to or make any comments, we will do our best to kind of curate them as fast as possible and respond to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes before we close today out. So, Amber, if you don't mind, I have a question for you from somebody.
Okay.
It says, as a community member, how do you hold white community organizations accountable for saying one thing in support of Black Lives Matter, such as putting out a public statement, but do the opposite, such as perpetuate anti-Black racism?
So I think that's twofold, because there is the need for explicit statements. There is the recognition that while some organizations or businesses are doing it so that they don't lose money, right? So that they're able to be in the now. That is first and foremost the acknowledgement of the Black dollar. Okay, if you're not willing to lose it, then it matters. And then the other part of that is calling them out when it is different. So it is twofold. It's acknowledging that the statement does need to be made, even if the organization is imperfect, even if there are policies that are inequitable, they need to make the statement. It needs to be explicit that they acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. And then on the flip side, it is up to us, if you will, and by us, I mean all of us co-conspirators that know that they are perpetuating certain inequities, policies, and practices, to then call them out, to assist with highlighting, spotlighting, illuminating, setting fire to those same policies so that they feel the pressure of change, or they won't. But it is first acknowledging that if it wasn't important to them, if they were not afraid of losing that same Black dollar, they wouldn't have made the statement in the first place.
Thank you. Here's another question, and Amber, if you don't mind, I'll field it, and if you want to respond, please do. It says, it's easy to feel powerless as one white person. Do you feel the most efficient way to support the cause is to utilize my dollar by donating and supporting ACLU, NAACP, and so on? They work on these full-time at the institutional level. So while I can do the intra and interpersonal work, what do you think is the best way to fight at the institutional level? This is a great question, and yes, I do think it is extremely important to support not only organizations that are have a explicit mission to dismantle racism, such as the NAACP. I would ask that you do your homework about maybe local organizations that are in the community doing the same thing. Some of the smaller nonprofits maybe that are boots on the ground in your community that are doing this work, but also supporting Black-owned or person of color-owned businesses in your community is another way to kind of address the institutional aspect of racism. Public advocacy in the form of voting and supporting get out the vote efforts in favor of candidates who are demonstrably anti-racist is critically important also. I cannot stress how critically important it is to emphasize getting out the vote as far as affecting institutional level racism. But the other thing too is, in terms of critical mass within your organization and influencing those people that are perhaps your C-suite, your executive suite folks in your organization who do kind of run in those circles with people that are pulling institutional levels and putting that kind of grassroots pressure, if you will, for the organization to be demonstrably anti-racist. You'd be surprised on how influential peer-to-peer work is in the realm of institutional executives. So a lot of the work that we do, Amber and I do, bringing, especially in the community like in the South where we are, and across the country, predominantly white, cisgender male, hetero leaders, and bringing those folks together in order to have the conversation, the difficult conversations like we've been having today. Starting with the peer-to-peer is extremely powerful in terms versus them just doing that checkbox diversity work of maybe just putting out a statement here or maybe just adding a person of color to the board. When they start to feel that influence from their peers, it seems to be more effective at getting change at that institutional level. So continue to work at building that grassroots momentum with your organization in order to affect the institution. Appreciate there's so many questions and responses. I appreciate that. From a logistics standpoint, folks asked about will these slides be available to listeners? Absolutely. And Amber and I believe in walking the walk. So anything that we do at our organizations, we is open to the public to use as long as it can be used to advance racial equity and inclusion, then we encourage you to use it. So you'll see that information coming to you. Let's see. Here's one, Amber. I'll pose this as the final question, Amber, to you. It says, my agency works in food access, and while our teams in the field are representative of the communities we serve, as you go up higher into our agency culture, it becomes more monochromatic. How do we, as those delivering services on the ground, communicate those making larger scale decisions for our agency when they don't have the firsthand experience of racism? And I assume of working with people that are different from them while still communicating the importance of racial equity and dismantling supremacy within our organization. So this is sort of similar to the last question, Amber, but I'm curious, maybe from the point of view of as a person of color, how do you see using your agency in order to influence institutional and systemic change?
So if you have enough voices of those same people, leaders listen to what's going to affect their dollar. I mean, we're being honest. And I am one, while I am not, I do advocate sometimes for civil discourse. It could be starting with a conversation, like genuinely starting with a conversation. And it could also mean that you need to bring in an outside organization to make them aware of that. Sometimes it is genuinely not purposeful that organizations are mirroring themselves at the top, because affinity bias is real. And the affinity bias is simply where we like things that are similar to ourselves. And so if there's no one else that is a person of color, higher up, well, then people are going to mirror themselves unintentionally sometimes. But that's where the people that are at the bottom need to make sure that they're sending communications that say, this is what we're asking for. When those things are not happening, then it may be time to move to more aggressive, if you will. I mean, I'm not talking unions, if you will, but being able to organize what is being asked, as far as even if you're writing, like make a list, document for what you are asking so that you know when it is asked of you. If what you're asking for is representation at the higher level, then you need to, state that. If what you're asking for is affinity groups, you need to state that. But it's not going to be just as easy as saying, oh, you're making policies and you don't look like me, because the average person wants to believe that they're doing the right thing for the right reason. That's why I believe I do what I do, because I don't believe the average person is intentionally prejudiced or intentionally racist or intentionally, discriminatory. So it's going to be organizing and then advocating for, and like Don said, you're gonna have to find a champion. Somebody in that C-suite, somebody in that executive office has a Black friend, they have a Latinx cousin, they have a God baby that is of Black or brown descent, and they empathize somehow. They need to hear you. You need to know. Their lives are public. Everybody's on social media. Find out what means something to that person. Find your champion. We need allies.
Thank you, Amber. And actually, there are a couple more questions that, and we've got about 5 or so minutes that I want to get to. And I'll put this one out there, Amber, and if you want to respond first, you want me to respond, I can. It's our organization serves and employs mostly people of color, but our board is 70% white, and many don't understand why we need to self-reflect and look at racism within our organization. How can our staff leadership push the board to start these conversations when they are blind to the issue? This is something that I think is extremely common, and I'm sure that everyone listening right now, just about everyone listening right now, can relate, to this. And nonprofit boards across the country have got to, look at themselves in the mirror and do this intrapersonal work. And I think with, I mentioned it earlier about the adaptation of slavery that metastasizes and turns into just other forms of a racial cancer. That's kind of my point with boards, is that this is a time of reckoning for white-led organizations, and our nonprofit industry is predominantly led, whether at the board level or at the executive level, by white people. And I understand the irony of myself saying this, being a white person that leads a nonprofit organization. But I can tell you that some of the power that an executive has, and you mentioned your staff leadership, is dictating to some extent board meetings, depending on how frequently you meet with boards, but in making sure that you incorporate in every single board meeting a mission moment, let's say, that involves putting board members in those uncomfortable situations, those uncomfortable positions. Also, the idea of, like Amber said, is the bottom line matters, whether you're a for-profit or nonprofit, and the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion as a economic strategy is you can't argue against it. There's innumerable amount of research based on that, and that's something that I've seen work with my organization. The organization we consult with is making the case for at least diverse representation within the board, and how that's just good for business. And sometimes it feels shallow going in that direction, but it's important if you can get your foot in the door and start to build people's capacity, the white leadership capacity, to think that way. Then I do believe that opens their hearts and minds to having the larger discussion of how important anti-racism is to the larger society. So just make sure that when you have your interactions with them, that you're doing as much as you can to incorporate anti-racism in the communications and the experience of the board, and hopefully, as far as also board leadership, that you're identifying and cultivating and then putting in positions of board leadership people that are actively allies and actively anti-racist.
And the only thing I'll add is that Don mentioned that we are happy to share resources. So at the end, he is going to give our contact information. And it just so happens that one of my mentors, the amazing Dr. Joy Nicole Martinez, who has 17 million degrees and other such things, who also has her own agency, just partnered with Boardly. I think that's what Boardable. I have to go back, but to create a document literally that talks about how to create diversity in your organization as far as boards and nonprofits are concerned. So I'm happy to share that. If you are willing, if you email me after he shares our contact information, I will send that information to you.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, before I ask this last question, the last thing I want to say about that too is that it's important to understand that you have to balance patience with persistence in this work. There is no turnkey solution. Complex, messy problems require complex, messy solutions. And so you have to understand that the work of changing a culture, which changing the board dynamic or the board makeup, is part of changing culture at a nonprofit organization, that this will take time, but it has to be intentional. So you need to have a strategy for how to do that, and set goals and steps that can be achieved in order to get to that point where you do have a more representative board.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for the last question, I'm going to pose this to you, Amber. A lot of people have talked about how there's a lack of action and response from their organization or leadership in terms of being anti-racist, and that's harmful to people of color within the organization. How do you suggest that our listeners make leadership understand the need for accountability and owning or acknowledging the harm that is being done by inaction or the lack of action?
So I think that that's going to be similar to the things that we've already kind of mentioned. You're going to have a plan. The same way we are saying that organizations have to have a plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It sounds like, aggressive, but a list of demands is what you're needing to draft. You're needing to know exactly what you're asking for. Simply saying that this culture isn't conducive to inclusivity isn't tangible. They need to know, what do you mean by this culture? Like, is it this manager? Is it this statement? Is it this? Like, be explicit in what you are asking. Make your list of demands and how you are wanting, if you will, to have those changes made. And so it's not, again, going to be this, like he said, this one size fits all. And you're going to need to have consensus, and the voices that you're saying are not being represented. You need to make sure that your list of demands is as inclusive of the Black and brown voices that are in your organization as the change that you're trying to make. But it's still going to take, at the end of the day, finding a champion, short of striking or publicly calling out those organizations or leadership. Then it's going to take a champion, someone that is actually in that area. But before we, really quickly, I have a comment that I'm reading that says, I'm a 70-year-old suburban white woman with several African-American families on my block. We say hello, but no one usually hanging out front to chat, and essentially want to know how to go about brokering conversations. So there is no secret. I'm Black, and I know I'm Black. And when someone is talking to me because I'm Black, it's not a secret to me. And I'm okay with that, right? If the intentions are or what I always say is, what comes from the heart reaches the heart, okay? So I have a friend or a colleague that upon the death of George Floyd, she sent me flowers, okay? I had never received flowers for being Black, but I thought that this was an interesting gift. And what I essentially knew she was saying is, I don't know what the heck to say, but I want to say something. And so those flowers meant everything to me, because I knew she was looking and grasping for some way to broker a conversation or let me know that I was on her mind or I thought about her. So what if your way to broker that conversation is first you making a statement? Do you have a sign in your yard that says Black Lives Matter? Do you have a sign that lets them know that you're explicit in your feelings as well? And in the event that you're wanting to have a conversation, again, it has never, ever one time been a secret when someone was talking to me because I'm Black. So as long as we're going to be upfront and you're going to be okay with being uncomfortable, like he said, because if not, then we have to have this conversation where it pretends like we're not talking because we're different races, but we really are talking because we're different races. At the end of the day, the intent is to get past that. The intent is you saying, listen, I'm white and I don't even know how to start this conversation. What I am saying is that I want to be an ally and I don't know how to do that. I literally have conversations in my text messages all the time that are just that. I don't know what to say, but I got a question. If we're going to have it, let's have it. So I guess that's what I'm saying. What comes from the heart reaches the heart. And if you're willing to be uncomfortable, then you're going to have to say the uncomfortable thing. I'm white and I don't know what to say. Let's talk.
Thank you, Amber. So we appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, everyone that participated just by being here. That is part of the first step, is just being present and going out of your way to again receive and reflect on new information when it comes to racism and white supremacy. I want to point out that the next webinar as part of this series is going to be September 1st, 1 to 3 o'clock Eastern time. If you have not already received an email holding that date and time for you, you'll be receiving that relatively soon. So just please keep a lookout for that, and go ahead, if you can, block off your calendars. There'll be 3 more after that. And again, this is an intentionally designed series. Next week, we will be talking about the amplifying your ability to act, and having the specifically about having conversations with white colleagues around racism and white supremacy. And then the next 3 sessions will also, again, kind of build off that. And then finally, here's the contact information for Amber and I and our organizations. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any concerns, questions, and just need to have somebody that you feel comfortable with sharing kind of more where you are, and we are happy to the best of our ability to answer as many questions and address as many concerns as possible.
I will be your Black friend, but I would not be your only Black friend. Okay.
So thank you all so very much. We're at time now, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we will see you all in a couple weeks.
Smile, Don.
Sorry.
What? Okay, wait. Smile again. Oh, okay, wait. Not today.
There's my face.
No, I pushed the wrong button. Hold on. Okay, there we go. 1, 2, 3. There. All right.
Why don't you go ahead and end the presentation, Donald?
Done.